when rules were suspended quietly. No announcement marked the change. No law was repealed. No authority stepped forward to explain what had shifted. And yet, for a brief and critical moment, rules that once seemed immovable simply stopped being enforced the way they had been before. To understand why this mattered, we need to return to a system built on predictability. Rules were meant to reduce uncertainty, limit discretion, and ensure fairness. They created trust by promising that outcomes would follow process, not power. But rules also assume time to apply them, debate them, and absorb their consequences. In a crisis, time is the first thing to disappear. The first reveal begins with selective hesitation. Deadlines passed without action. Penalties were delayed. Requirements remained written, but responses softened. Nothing was officially suspended, yet enforcement lost urgency. Those watching closely sensed it immediately. The rules were still there, but they were no longer pressing down with the same weight. The second beat followed as institutions adjusted behavior. Compliance became interpretive. Obligations were met in spirit rather than letter. Regulators asked questions instead of issuing orders. The system shifted from automatic response to human judgment. What mattered was no longer strict adherence, but avoiding irreversible damage. What made this moment unusual was its coordination. This was not one authority acting alone. Across jurisdictions, the same restraint appeared almost simultaneously. No meeting produced it. No document aligned it. Yet everyone understood the same risk. Enforcing rules fully, all at once, could fracture the system they were meant to protect. By the time observers began asking whether rules had been suspended, the answer was already complicated. Nothing had changed on paper. Everything had changed in practice. The system had chosen survival over consistency, quietly, temporarily, and without permission. This was not rule-breaking. It was rule-bending by silence. And once silence becomes a tool of governance, the meaning of rules themselves begins to shift. As the quiet suspension continued, its effects rippled outward. Institutions recalculated obligations that had once felt absolute. What mattered was no longer whether rules could be enforced, but whether enforcing them would cause more harm than restraint. Judgment replaced automation. Context overruled precedent. The reveal deepened as participants learned to read signals instead of statutes. Silence from regulators became information. Delayed responses were interpreted as tolerance. Flexibility spread not because it was declared, but because it was mirrored. When no penalties arrived, caution eased. When no warnings were issued, assumptions shifted. The conflict emerged beneath this calm. Rules exist to protect fairness, especially under stress. Suspending them, even quietly, created uneven advantage. Those closest to decision-makers sensed the change first. Others followed later, or not at all. Compliance became asymmetric. Stability was preserved, but equality thinned. The buildup intensified as time passed. What began as temporary hesitation risked becoming expectation. Each day enforcement remained soft. The harder became to restore firmness without shock. Participants adapted to discretion. Systems adjusted to flexibility. Returning to rigidity now felt dangerous. Inside institutions, discomfort grew. Officials knew rules could not be ignored forever. Yet reasserting them abruptly risked triggering exactly the collapse restraint had avoided. Silence had solved the immediate problem, but it offered no roadmap back to normality. The system was stable, but suspended between states. By now, a subtle shift had occurred. Authority was no longer expressed through enforcement alone. It was expressed through timing. Knowing when not to act became as powerful as knowing when to intervene. Rules still existed, but their force depended on judgment rather than certainty. The system had survived by pausing the weight of its own rules. But pausing is not the same as resolving. And the longer rules remain suspended quietly, the more fragile their return becomes. The tension reached its peak when the system realized restraint had created a new dependency. Once enforcement softened, behavior recalibrated around that softness. Plans assumed delay. Risk budgets expanded quietly. Decisions once constrained by rule now floated in a gray zone shaped by expectation rather than law. The conflict sharpened as consequences diverged. Some actors use flexibility to survive, others use it to advance. Without clear signals, the line between relief and advantage blurred. Fairness, one of the original promises of rule-based systems, became harder to defend. Stability held, but legitimacy thinned. The buildup intensified when pressure failed to recede. The crisis did not end cleanly. It lingered. Each additional week of restraint made restoration more dangerous. Reasserting rules now risked sudden cliff effects. Obligations deferred would collide at once. The pause had smooth impact, but it had also compressed it. Authorities faced a narrowing corridor. Act too soon and trigger fracture. Act too late and normalize discretion. Internally, debates shifted from compliance to choreography. The question was no longer whether to enforce rules, but how to reintroduce weight without causing collapse. Timing became policy. Participants sensed the uncertainty. Markets priced not regulation, but the probability of its return. Volatility reflected guessing games about enforcement dates rather than fundamentals. The system functioned, yet it felt provisional, as if operating on borrowed time. Confidence depended on belief that someone, somewhere, still controlled the switch. What became clear was a deeper truth about governance under stress. Rules derive power not only from clarity, but from credibility of application. Once credibility is paused, restoring it requires more than resuming enforcement. It requires rebuilding the expectation that rules will matter again. By this stage, survival had been achieved, but at the cost of simplicity. The system stood balanced between order and discretion, unsure which would define the future. Silence had bought time, but time now demanded a decision, because rules can bend quietly only for so long. Eventually, they must either return with force or be replaced by something else. The turning point arrived when authorities chose re-entry over retreat. Rules would not snap back into place overnight. Doing so would have shattered the calm restraint had created. Instead, enforcement returned gradually, deliberately, and with visible intent. Silence ended, not with punishment, but with signal. The climax unfolded as expectations were reset in stages. Deadlines were reintroduced with notice. Requirements regained weight incrementally. The system was reminded, not shocked. What mattered was not severity, but predictability. Participants needed to know that rules would matter again, and when this shift restored something deeper than compliance, it restored legitimacy. Fairness regained meaning once discretion stopped feeling permanent. Actors recalibrated behavior towards structure rather than assumption. Flexibility returned to being exception instead of environment. Stability no longer depended on guessing silence. The resolution settled slowly. Some weaknesses surfaced. Deferred obligations collided, but the impact was absorbed because it was anticipated. The system endured not because rules vanished, but because their return was managed. Order reasserted itself without erasing the lessons restraint had taught. What remained from this episode was a lasting insight. Rules are strongest not when they're inflexible, but when their application is credible. Suspending them quietly can save a system once. Restoring them thoughtfully is what saves it long-term. Europe learned that silence can protect stability, but it cannot replace governance. Rules may bend in crisis, but they must eventually speak again. So, what do you think? When rules return after silence, do they feel stronger or more fragile? When